All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, on Monday, you all heard my praise for Republican Senator Josh Hawley's plan. Released Friday, it would keep every single fired American worker on payroll and even would apply retroactively to anyone let go at this point. As I said at the time, it is the most economically progressive legislation introduced to date, and it represents a possible sea change moment for the GOP. And as I also said at the time, I was sure some of the more traditional corporate elements within the GOP would fight it with everything they had. And I was right. Though, there is still a small glimmer of hope. The proposals so far, coupled with the past efforts of Senator Marco Rubio, put forward a playbook for populists to wield power against corporate elements of their party and get at least some of what they want in whatever turns out to be in the next stimulus package. The key battle lines emerged Friday in Politico, which Hawley's proposal sets up a clash within the GOP. The Politico story notes that many in the caucus want to, quote, wait and see how the last bailout package does before anybody else does anything. And if they do anything, then they'll simply step up the unemployment provisions or add more money to the Paycheck Protection Program. Now look, I think that's fine. But those who watch this show know that these programs have their own drawbacks and on their own simply do not meet the economic catastrophic moment that we live in. The traditional GOP's thoughts were best summed up by John Thune of the Senate GOP leadership. He told Politico, quote, the ink's barely dry on the $2 trillion that we have got just signed into law. The direct payments haven't hit yet. And then when we're spending that kind of money, we've got a responsibility to see what works and what doesn't. I think you can read in between the lines of what that means, and I would encourage the senator to look up Herbert Hoover on Google if he wants to see what an austerity mindset in the middle of a literal depression will do to your party. Another member of leadership, Shelley Moore Capito, she says that instead of the extension of the Paycheck Protection Program would be a, quote, higher priority for Congress. And again, I think that's great. But the problem right now is everybody from private equity to venture capital firms are scrambling to get the administration to qualify them for small business loans. And through no fault of the designers, it is facing difficulty in implementation. But what puts Hawley's plan over the edge is that there isn't a means test. Nobody has to scramble for qualification. Businesses get their payroll met in this time of immense crisis. Mom and pop shops do not suffer because of the political connections of the financial industry. Everyone gets made whole. Everyone makes their rent. On the other side, we resume our struggles. Policy aside, however, the game was given away at the end of the Politico story when it noted that the Paycheck Protection Program's extension was the path of least resistance. It could garner support and, of course, make it so the senators do not have to return to Washington to, do their jobs. And right now, that seems likely. Congress is poised to vote Thursday to extend another $250 billion to the program, and more power to them. But from the above quotes I've read from GOP senators, I know they would be very willing to call it a day just at that, and that isn't enough. The Hawley plan and the current willingness to fight for it, and even to drag people to Washington, is how you actually move the Overton window on the right and force corporate-dominated leadership to listen to you and perhaps even incorporate some of your ideas into legislation. And the reason he must, and we must, fight for plans like this is that it took just a matter of a month for Marco Rubio's Paycheck Protection Plan to become the default option for bipartisanship, the weak way out for corporate-friendly elements. Extending billions to small businesses is just the starting point now, from where most of these GOP senators wouldn't have even considered doing such a thing a month ago. That's how real political change happens. You force your opponents to shift the ground that they stand on so that even when they think they're winning, you have already won. And it shows how slow but sure efforts by populists within the GOP can come to define the party and the country in no time. And just to give you an idea just how far Hawley's moved the Overton window with this move, it even drew praise from Nancy Pelosi's progressive challenger, Shahid Buttar, who said, quote, this is a surprisingly progressive move from a GOP senator. Though I support universal benefits and oppose employer subsidies, his approach carries profound political risks for centrist Democrats. They are so committed to the past, they risk missing the future. And I thought that was probably
well said.
I think it was well said, but also just when it goes to show, like, Nancy Pelosi's progressive challenger is praising this particular
Josh
plan.
Hawley, yeah.
You're like, whoa, what's going on in America? The reason I think that it's very important for this plan to move forward and for them is that as I laid out with the Paycheck Protection Program, which is that just a month ago, imagine the default position pumping $500 billion of loans to small businesses. And as we said, there are problems with the program. People aren't getting the loans. The banks are not implementing it properly. There's a lot of mess whenever it comes to things like this.
Yeah.
But with the Fed now being able to give loans based on these things to the banks, we're actually capitalizing these institutions to a decent enough level, and it could work. It's not going to be the be-all, end-all savior of the economy. But this is how fast you can change ground in D.C. just like that. But you have to fight on the margins in order to get some of what you want in order to actually get it enacted. And as I said at the time, I don't think it's actually going to happen. But if elements of it, like with the Paycheck Protection Program, get instituted, you can see how quickly, so when somebody proposes something even more economically progressive, they're like, no, we've already got our thing right here. And I think that is the most profound thing of how the debate works out.
Well, and why were they able to get that? It's because Republican and Democratic leadership wanted their corporate bailout.
Yeah.
So they had leverage. They were like, we're not voting for your massive corporate slush fund,
Yes.
your multi-trillion-dollar Federal Reserve loan concierge corporate bailout program with no oversight unless we at least get this thing.
And more direct payments. More
direct pay,
Yeah.
one time,
Right.
means tested. Look, as we've covered here, it is wholly inadequate. But the only reason they were able to even get that was because they were willing to hold hostage something that the leadership of both parties really wanted.
Exactly.
Moving from here forward, I don't see that they have any leverage to get anything more that they want. And look, Bernie Sanders is actually, they're very similar to the Hawley proposal. He wants 100% of paychecks to be covered. Very similar approach. It's an approach that other countries around the world have taken that seems to have worked out better for them because it's kept workers in their jobs, which is, important. Of course, we can talk about how many of those jobs weren't so great to start with. But let's start there with people keeping the jobs that they have. But I don't see how it happens because you have nothing left of value to hold out over because they already got their big corporate slush
There's
fund.
one thing they do have value, which is these senators do not want to come back to Washington.
Yeah, and that is a strong point of leverage because it's also just like, I think if you ask the American people, should these people be in Washington doing their jobs? Like 90-some% of them would be like, of course they should be, of course, right? So in terms of a public messaging perspective, that's not nothing.
Yeah, no, it's not nothing. And on Thursday, they're going to try and pass this thing through unanimous consent where one person can hold it up. Whether that's going to happen, I don't know. But I do know that they're going to face, look, the political conditions of this are just implausible for them to ignore, especially in the 3 weeks. So let's say that nobody objects in the unanimous consent. They're going to come back. They're going to have to pass something. There's just no question. $250 billion extra for the Paycheck Protection Program is great, but that is when I think the real fight will begin to occur again because, again, we don't know yet what the actual battle lines will emerge on this. Nancy Pelosi and them, they haven't actually had anything other than increasing the direct cash payments or increasing small business. That generally seems to be the bipartisan position, but it could be on holding up key elements of that in order to push what they need into the plan. And I think the ultimate leverage will actually just be the political conditions. On Thursday, we're going to get our new unemployment numbers. What is that going to be? Maybe 20 million?
Yeah, I don't think they care. I think what they care about is, because what have we seen both times when we got these unemployment numbers and then the stock market jumps up the next day? It's honestly, it's disgusting. And it shows how disconnected the reality of people's lives are from these indicators like the stock market that we're supposed to be so obsessed with. But that's all they care about. If the markets were to tank again in the way that they were, then you would have some leverage. But as long as the markets are recovering and chugging along and not falling off a cliff the way that they were, and I haven't looked to see how futures are this morning, but as long as that's the case, they don't care to do anything.
Yeah, well, we have to hope for a couple of conditions. A, that we know the economy is rotten. I think we know that.
Yeah.
B, which is a lot of it is astroturfed, and the stock market doesn't actually reflect the real economic conditions.
Of course.
And so what we're going to see is, look, a lot of the things that we've predicted on this show, corporate mortgage crisis, that's still going to happen.
Yeah.
We don't actually have the numbers yet. We'll talk about it later in the show about the amount of rent. Financial contagion within the system is still incredibly possible.
Yeah.
And the fact that Wall Street, this is the fakery of the Dow Jones and so much of this. It's all just like day-to-day bets based on like whatever material conditions, and they don't incorporate a lot of the long-term strategy. I would say there's a general bet that there's still going to be economic catastrophe over the next month and a half to 2 months. This puts you in the place where you can push for becoming what might be the default position. And that's where people, I think, like Hawley, Bernie Sanders, and some of these others, you can set up the conditions for the 595 win. Because that's ultimately what happened with, I mean, look, nobody wanted to do Paycheck Protection Program at the time. But Marco Rubio teamed up, I think it was Ben Cardin, with another Democratic senator. They got it passed with like very little support because they were willing to tie it into direct cash payments and into the corporate bailout. This time around, we don't yet know what those conditions are. But what I can see is that there's an opening. That opening did happen. And ultimately, they moved it so the bipartisan thing is to give people incredible, like a lot of money based upon what their past positions would have been for an extra $250 billion, getting the Federal Reserve involved. That's not nothing.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't say, and I don't think it's enough. And that's the whole point of this whole show, of this monologue, is that none of it is enough, but is that is how you slowly can take change, because none of these people would have supported it 2 months ago. And 2 months ago, they would have said, I never would support a program like this. You use the crisis in order to push things slowly. It's never going to be very satisfying. I think that's the real problem with all of this.
I'm just not convinced that any of them is actually willing to go hard enough to get any more than they've already gotten. Honestly, I mean, you remember Thomas Massey when everybody come back and vote. Do you remember how he was excoriated by the media? And look, I'm not a big Thomas Massey fan, and his objections to the bill were not the same objections as mine. Yeah. But he was actually willing to be like, no, people should have to vote on this. And I mean, the Democrats and everyone tries selfish. Imagine calling someone selfish for wanting our legislators to come back to Washington, D.C. and do their jobs in the way that so many of you are still required to do, which are out there on the front lines as essential workers, often without any sort of real protection, often without hazard pay, etc. These cosseted, privileged people think it's selfish for them to have to come back and do their job. So it's just a lot that you have to be willing to take on if you're going to take that stance. And frankly, I haven't seen the willingness yet.
No, nobody's had the willingness. I mean, look, everybody voted for that.
They all voted for it.
Everybody voted for it.
And they didn't end up forcing a real roll call vote so that their names would be on the record, yes or no.
So there's reasons for optimism and reasons for pessimism. So that's what I think.
All right, we'll leave it there. Next on Rising, rent was due Monday. In front of the show, Will Jawanda is going to tell us what he's doing to get some help to renters right here in the D.C. area when Rising continues.